Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Short Ghost Stories, a place where midnight chills come to life. Wondering what's coming long after midnight? Expect spine-tingling tales of ghosts and spirits, haunted places, and things that move after dark. Short Ghost Stories, long after midnight. The Curse of the Ashbourne Hotel. On certain autumn nights, when the fog drifts low over the old roads of northern England, and the moon hangs pale behind a veil of cloud, travellers still speak in hushed voices of a place called the Ashbourne Hotel. Some say it once stood along the coach road just beyond the town of Blackmere, where the land fell into narrow lanes and marshy fields, and the lamps of the nearest houses were no more than distant stars in the mist. Others claim no such road ever existed at all, and that the hotel was never meant to be found, except by those already half lost in the darkness. Its name does not appear on modern maps. No carriage route marks its position. No one living can say with certainty where its gates once stood. And yet, from time to time, there are those who swear they have seen it. A tall Victorian building of blackened brick and narrow windows, a lantern burning beside the entrance. Warm golden light beneath a roof line sharp against the fog. A brass sign over the door, dulled with age, reading simply, Ashbourne Hotel. The last man known to have entered its doors was Edward Harrow. At least he was the last man anyone ever saw return. Edward Harrow was not by nature a superstitious man. He was 36 years of age, a writer by profession, and the sort of gentleman whose habits had been shaped more by books than by people. He had spent the better part of 10 years traveling from town to town, collecting local histories, peculiar traditions, and forgotten legends for a volume he intended one day to publish. He preferred old churches to new cities, graveyards to drawing rooms, and innkeepers' tales to academic lectures. It was a solitary life, though not an unhappy one. In late October of 1897, he found himself on the road back from the western counties, having spent several weeks gathering material in remote villages, where ancient customs still clung to daily life like ivy to stone walls. The weather had worsened with unusual suddenness. What began as a damp afternoon had, by evening, become a bitter and airless night. The clouds lowered, the wind died, a white, suffocating fog spread over the road. Edward had hired a small carriage that morning and expected to reach Blackmere before dark. Instead, somewhere along the last stretch of the country lane, one wheel struck a hidden rut and splintered against a buried stone. The driver, an old man with a heavy scarf wrapped around his neck, climbed down at once and examined the damage with a lantern in his trembling hand. "It's no use, sir," he said after a moment. "The axle's bent. We shan't get much farther tonight." Edward stepped down from the carriage, boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. The fog had grown so thick that even the horse's head appeared blurred and ghostly. How far to Blackmere? 3 miles, perhaps 4. Edward looked into the blank whiteness ahead. "And if I walk?" The driver glanced uneasily along the road. "You might reach it. You might miss the turn entirely. Hard to say in weather like this." Edward had no wish to spend the night half frozen beside a broken carriage. He gathered his bag, wrapped his coat tighter, paid the driver, and set off alone into the fog. At first, the road seemed straightforward enough. The hedges on either side rose like dark walls, dripping with moisture. Gravel crunched softly beneath his boots. Somewhere far off, an owl cried once, and then was silent. After 15 minutes, Edward could no longer see behind him. After 20, he could barely see the road ahead. The fog swallowed everything. Trees emerged only when he was upon them. Milestones loomed like grave markers and vanished again. The night seemed to grow quieter with each step, until the world was reduced to the dull thud of his own footsteps and the faint scrape of his breathing in the cold. He pressed on. By the time he began to suspect he had missed the road to Blackmere altogether, the darkness had deepened and the damp had soaked through his gloves. He stopped beneath what he thought was an elm tree and listened. Nothing. No sound of horse or cart. No barking dog. No church bell from any distant village. Then, through the whiteness ahead, he saw a glow. It was so faint at first that he mistook it for a trick of tired eyes, but as he walked toward it, the glow sharpened into the steady amber light of a lantern, and beside it, slowly emerging from the fog, stood a building. Edward halted. It was larger than any roadside inn had a right to be in so remote a place. 4 stories high, perhaps more, with tall black windows, steep gables, and narrow chimneys rising like dark fingers into the moonlit mist. Its brick facade seemed almost swallowed by shadow, yet several windows shone faintly from within. A gas lamp burned near the entrance, casting a pool of gold across wet stone steps. Above the doorway hung a weathered brass sign, Ashbourne Hotel. Edward stared at it with deep relief. Where there was a hotel, there would be warmth, food, and a bed. He mounted the steps and pushed open the door. At once a wave of warmth met him. The entrance hall beyond was quiet and dimly elegant. A red runner stretched across polished dark wood. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, though only half its lamps were lit. To the left stood a drawing room with a low fire burning in the grate. To the right was a reception desk of carved oak, behind which stood a thin gentleman in a black waistcoat. He looked up the instant Edward entered as if he had been expecting him. "Good evening, sir," the man said in a calm, measured voice. "Welcome to the Ashbourne Hotel." Edward removed his gloves. "Good evening. I confess I had not expected to find a hotel out here." The gentleman gave a faint smile. "Many of our guests say the same." He was perhaps in his late 50s, with silver hair parted neatly at the side, a pale face, and dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to rest upon Edward with unusual steadiness. "My name is Whitmore," he said. "I manage the house." Edward Harrow. "A pleasure, Mr. Harrow. You have come on a difficult night." "That I have. My carriage broke down on the road. I should be grateful for a room." Mr. Whitmore inclined his head. "Of course, we always have room for travelers who arrive late." The wording struck Edward as slightly odd, though he could not say why. Whitmore turned a large leather-bound register toward him and placed a pen beside it. "If you would be so kind." Edward bent to sign his name. The page was already filled with neat signatures in various hands. He noticed at once that the ink on some entries had faded to a rusty brown. The dates in the margin caught his eye. October 1889, November 1891, December 1878. He paused. Whitmore said quietly, "Is something amiss?" Edward glanced up. "Your register appears to include very old entries." "It is an old house, Mr. Harrow." "Yes, but Whitmore's expression did not change. "Our records are kept with great care." Edward, not wishing to seem rude after having requested shelter, signed his name and closed the book. Whitmore handed him a brass key attached to a small oval tag. "Room 12, he said. "Second floor. Dinner is being served in the dining room, if you wish it." "I do. Thank you." A bellboy did not appear. No servant emerged to take Edward's bag. Whitmore merely stepped aside and gestured toward a staircase beyond the hall. Edward set his bag down at the foot of the stairs and followed the scent of roast meat and wine into the dining room. Only 3 other guests were present. The first was a woman of perhaps 60, dressed in deep blue silk with a high collar and a lace brooch at her throat. Her skin was pale in a way that seemed not delicate but bloodless. She sat very straight and ate little, though her plate had been served. When Whitmore introduced her as Mrs. Caldwell, she inclined her head without smiling. The second was a broad-shouldered gentleman with spectacles and a heavy gray mustache. He introduced himself as Dr. Halverson and spoke in a distracted manner, as if his thoughts were elsewhere. When Edward asked how long he had been staying at the hotel, the doctor frowned slightly before answering. "A good while," he said. "A very good while." The third guest sat near the far wall in a dark coat, his chair turned partly from the table. He did not offer his name. He neither ate nor drank. He only stared into the fire with such complete stillness that Edward wondered more than once whether he was asleep with his eyes open. The meal itself was excellent, though strangely silent. The cutlery scarcely clinked. No laughter stirred the room. When Edward attempted conversation, speaking of the weather, the roads, the rising cost of travel, the others listened politely, yet their replies were brief and curiously absent. More than once they seemed not to understand what he meant when he referred to current events. "The Jubilee processions in London were remarkable this year," Edward said at one point. Mrs. Caldwell looked at him with mild confusion. "Which year?" "This year," Edward replied. "97. At that, Dr. Halverson slowly lowered his fork. "97, he repeated. Something in the room changed. Not visibly, not enough to name. Yet Edward felt it all the same, a tightening in the silence as if he had touched upon some subject better left alone. Whitmore appeared at Edward's shoulder with a decanter, though Edward had not heard him enter. "More wine, Mr. Harrow." "No, thank you." Whitmore set the decanter down and said evenly, "Guests often lose track of time here." Edward gave a short laugh. "I hope I shall not be here long enough for that." Whitmore met his eyes. "One never knows." The phrase, delivered without emphasis, disturbed Edward more than he cared to admit. After dinner he collected his bag and climbed the stairs to room 12. The corridor on the second floor was narrow and lined with patterned wallpaper gone dark with age. Lamps burned low in wall sconces, casting pools of yellow light that seemed to float in the surrounding gloom. His room lay near the center of the hall and proved comfortable, if old-fashioned. A 4-poster bed, a washstand, a writing desk, a coal fire burning softly in the grate, and curtains of heavy green velvet drawn across the window. Edward unpacked only enough for the night. Before sleeping, he pulled aside the curtains and looked out. There was nothing beyond the glass but fog, no road, no trees, no faint lamps from any village. Only a pale, shifting emptiness pressed close against the pane, reflecting back the ghostly outline of his room. He let the curtain fall and prepared for bed. Sometime after midnight, he awoke. At first he did not know what had disturbed him. He lay still beneath the blankets, listening. The fire had burned low. The room was cold. Then he heard it, footsteps in the corridor, soft, slow, measured, not the brisk tread of a servant or the uncertain shuffle of a late guest, but the unhurried step of someone walking with deliberate purpose. The sound passed his door, paused, then continued toward the far end of the corridor. Edward rose, drew on his dressing gown, and opened the door. The hall was empty. He stepped out and looked both ways. The lamps guttered in their sconces, throwing long shadows across the wallpaper. Then, at the far end of the passage, he saw her, a woman in a gray Victorian dress, one hand trailing lightly along the wall as she walked toward the staircase. Her hair was pinned high, old-fashioned, even by provincial standards, and her head was bowed slightly, as if in grief. Edward opened his mouth to speak. She reached the top of the stairs and vanished. Not turned the corner, not descended. Vanished. Edward stood rooted to the spot, cold moving through his limbs. A lamp hissed softly overhead. Somewhere below, a clock ticked once, then stopped. He closed his door with great care and did not sleep again until dawn. Morning brought little comfort. Though the room showed signs of daylight, the fog beyond the window remained almost as thick as before. Edward dressed quickly and went downstairs, intending to leave after breakfast. Whatever oddness the Ashbourne Hotel possessed, he had no desire to linger and study it more closely. Yet, when he entered the lobby, he found the great clock above the mantel had stopped at 11:55. He frowned and looked at his pocket watch. 9:20. Mr. Whitmore stood behind the desk, immaculate as ever. "Good morning, Mr. Harrow. Your clock has stopped." "Yes." "Has no one wound it?" Whitmore folded his hands. "It has no need of winding." Edward waited for further explanation. None came. "I should like breakfast," he said. "It is served." Breakfast was laid in the dining room exactly as dinner had been. Silver service, fine china, warm food, and a silence that seemed to deepen rather than lessen in daylight. Mrs. Caldwell was there again, hands folded beside her untouched teacup. Dr. Halverson sat reading a newspaper so old that the paper had yellowed to brown. Edward took his seat. "Good morning." They nodded. After a pause, Edward said, "I intend to resume my journey today, once the fog clears." Mrs. Caldwell turned her pale eyes toward him. "Does it clear?" she asked. Edward smiled faintly. "Fog always clears." Dr. Halverson lowered his newspaper and regarded him over the rims of his spectacles with something close to pity. "Not here," he said. Edward set down his cup. "What exactly does that mean?" But the doctor had already turned back to the paper. Frustrated, Edward finished his meal and resolved to leave at once whether the weather improved or not. He took his bag, crossed the lobby, and opened the front doors. There was no road outside, no carriage tracks, no hedges, no stone steps leading to a lane, only fog. It pressed so close and thick beyond the threshold that it seemed almost solid. The hotel might have stood on the edge of an abyss, for all that could be seen past the door. Edward stepped forward cautiously, extending one foot beyond the stone. The instant he did so, a terrible dizziness seized him. The whiteness before him deepened into a blank and depthless void. He staggered back at once, heart hammering, and the sensation vanished. He shut the door. Behind him, Whitmore's voice said, "I would advise against wandering too far in weather like this." Edward turned sharply. "Where is the road?" Whitmore regarded him calmly. "Outside." "There is nothing outside." "There is always something outside, Mr. Harrow." Edward stared at him. "What sort of answer is that?" "The only honest one." Edward left the lobby without replying. He spent the next several hours exploring the hotel in mounting unease. The ground floor contained the dining room, drawing room, reception hall, and a library deeper within the building. The upper floors held long corridors of guest rooms, though many doors were locked and several bore no numbers. He heard no sound of servants. No maids made beds. No porters carried trunks. No housekeeper swept ashes from the grates. Yet everything remained impossibly clean, as if maintained by unseen hands. The library drew him at last. It was a narrow room lined floor to ceiling with books, though many were local histories, railway guides, sermons, and outdated almanacs. Dust lay thick upon the highest shelves, but curiously thin upon the desk near the window. Edward began to search the cabinets and drawers, driven less by reason than by a growing instinct that the hotel was withholding something from him. In a lower drawer of the desk he found a packet of old newspapers tied with ribbon. The topmost was dated November 4th, 1893. His eye moved at once to a headline on the front page. "Tragic Fire Claims Dozens at Ashbourne Hotel." Edward read the article standing where he found it. It described a fire that began shortly after midnight, spreading through the lower floors of the Ashbourne Hotel before the town brigade could arrive. Owing to the density of the fog that night and the speed of the blaze, no one within had escaped. The proprietor, Mr. Elias Whitmore, several members of staff, 21 guests, all dead. Edward read it twice. Then he looked again at the date, 1893. 4 years earlier, he searched the packet for more. There were follow-up accounts, inquiries into the fire, speculation about faulty lamps, lists of the dead. He found names that made his blood run cold. Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell, Dr. Henrik Halvorsen. And among the dead was one unnamed gentleman described only as a commercial traveler in dark attire, identity uncertain. Edward lowered the papers slowly. The room seemed suddenly colder than before. He hurried from the library and nearly collided with Mrs. Caldwell in the corridor beyond. Up close, her face appeared waxen, the skin fine and dry as paper. "Forgive me," Edward said, stepping back. She looked at the newspapers in his hand and seemed, for the first time since his arrival, genuinely sad. "You should not have found those yet," she said softly. Edward stared at her. "Yet?" Her gaze drifted past him toward the library. "Some of us waited longer. Mrs. Caldwell, what is this place?" Her lips parted, but before she could answer, Whitmore appeared at the far end of the corridor. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "you are needed in the drawing room." At once her expression emptied. She inclined her head and moved past Edward without another word. Whitmore approached with his usual composed step. "I see you have been reading." Edward thrust the newspaper toward him. "This hotel burned down in 1893. Whitmore glanced at the page only briefly. "Yes." Edward felt a chill more terrible than any he had yet known. "Then what is this place?" Whitmore folded his hands behind his back. "It is the Ashbourne Hotel." "Do not answer me in riddles." I do not speak in riddles, Mr. Harrow. I speak as plainly as I am able. You died in that fire. Whitmore's eyes did not leave Edward's face. Yes. For several moments neither man moved. Edward heard the blood beating in his ears. This is impossible. Whitmore gave the faintest shadow of a smile. And yet here you are. Edward backed away. I am leaving. Whitmore's expression did not alter. You may try. That evening the hotel changed. Until then, all its strangeness had existed at the edge of certainty. The old register, the silent guests, the stopped clock, the impossible article. But as the daylight faded, if indeed it was daylight beyond the fog, the Ashbourne Hotel seemed to shed what little remained of ordinary appearance. The lamps burned lower, though no one touched them. Cold seeped through the corridors, not like winter air, but like something drawn up from underground vaults. Shadows thickened in the corners. At times, Edward thought he heard distant voices behind the walls, too soft to make out, as though conversations from another century were murmuring just beneath the plaster. He locked himself in room 12 and sat fully dressed on the bed, listening. At some hour he could not measure, there came a sound from the passage outside, not footsteps now, but many footsteps, slow, coordinated, ascending the stairs. Edward rose and went to the door. He pressed his ear against the wood. Nothing. Then, very softly, from the opposite side came a woman's voice. Do not open it. He stepped back. Mrs. Caldwell, he whispered. No reply. Another voice followed, lower and rougher. Dr. Halverson. When the clock moves, it is too late. Edward turned toward the mantel. The room's small carriage clock, which had not worked when he entered, now ticked faintly. Once, twice. He snatched up his bag and threw open the door. The corridor was empty, but the lamps had dimmed to little more than embers behind clouded glass. At the far end, the staircase descended into darkness. He did not go down at once. Instead, he turned toward the rear corridor he had not yet fully explored, and hurried past unnumbered doors until he came upon a section of the hotel that seemed older than the rest. The wallpaper had blistered away here, exposing blackened plaster beneath. The air smelled faintly of smoke. At the very end of the passage stood a door with no handle. Set into the panel at eye level was a strip of dark glass, as though once it had allowed someone to look through from the other side. From behind it came a sound like breathing. Edward recoiled. The clock in his room ticked again somewhere behind him, impossibly loud. He ran, down the stairs, through the hall, into the lobby. The great clock above the mantel, stopped at 11:55 since his arrival, had begun to move. Its minute hand trembled upward. 11:56. In the drawing-room beyond, the other guests had gathered. Mrs. Caldwell stood beside the mantel, her face filled now not with emptiness but terror. Dr. Halvorsen stared at the clock as though he had seen this moment many times before. The dark-coated gentleman stood in the corner with his head bowed. "What happens at midnight?" Edward demanded. No one answered. Whitmore stood at the reception desk, hands resting lightly upon the wood. "The same thing that always happens," he said. Edward crossed the lobby in 3 strides and seized him by the collar. "End this." Whitmore neither flinched nor resisted. "I cannot." Edward shook him. "Then tell me how to leave." Whitmore spoke with grave patience. When the fire came, the guests were trapped. The windows would not open. The doors were lost behind smoke. Some burned where they stood, some hid in their rooms, some reached the halls only to find them filled with flame. They died frightened, confused, and unready. Edward released him slowly. Whitmore continued. Something remained afterward. The shape of the house, the memory of those within it, the need. What need? Whitmore looked toward the clock. To be occupied, 11:57. The hotel cannot stand empty, Whitmore said. It draws in those who are lost, those who arrive late, those who have nowhere else to go. Edward backed away. No, you signed the register. That is nothing. It is how the house knows your name. A burst of cold air swept through the lobby, though the doors were shut. In the walls there came a faint crackling sound, like fire catching. Edward turned and ran to the front entrance. He flung the doors wide. Fog, endless, white, lightless fog. He forced himself across the threshold. For 1 second he felt solid ground beneath his boots. For the next, nothing. A vast empty drop seemed to yawn beneath him. He staggered, lurched backward, and fell hard on the lobby floor as the doors slammed shut of their own accord. From above came a sound that chilled him utterly. Coughing. Dozens of voices coughing at once. The staircase filled slowly with figures. They emerged from the upper corridor and descended with dreadful calm. Men and women in clothes from another age, their faces pale, their eyes dark-rimmed, their skin marked in places by soot and burns. Some carried the posture of guests roused from sleep. Others looked as though they had been wandering for years without rest. Their mouths were closed, yet the sound of distant coughing seemed to come from them all. Mrs. Caldwell covered her face with trembling hands. Dr. Halvorsen whispered, "Again." Edward scrambled to his feet. "No," he said, though there was no force left in the word. The descending figures filled the stairs and spread across the landing. Whitmore spoke quietly behind him. "You must understand, Mr. Harrow, it is not malice. It is hunger, memory, habit. A house does what it was made to do." "A house?" Edward turned on him. "This is not a house." Whitmore's pale features tightened almost imperceptibly. It was once. The first of the burned guests stepped off the stairs into the lobby. A woman in a charred evening gown. A boy of no more than 14 clutching a melted toy soldier. A man whose beard had burned away on one side of his face. They moved not toward Whitmore, nor toward the others who belonged to the place, but toward Edward. He ran, through the drawing room, overturning a chair, into the dining room where the silver laid upon the tables had gone black with soot, through a swinging door into service passages behind the walls. Every hallway seemed longer than before. Every turn led to another passage, another staircase, another locked door. The hotel had become a maze assembled out of itself. Smoke drifted along the ceiling now, thin at first, then thicker. He wrapped his scarf over his mouth and plunged downward into the cellar. The steps ended in a stone corridor lined with wine racks and coal bins. Somewhere ahead a red glow flickered. Edward stopped. From the darkness came the faint crackle of flames and the smell of burning varnish. He backed away at once, turned another corner, and found himself staring into the lobby. Impossible though it was, he had circled back. The burned guests stood where he had left them, waiting. The great clock read 11:59. Edward's mind, driven to a terrible clarity by panic, seized upon one last hope. The library. If the hotel was memory, perhaps it could be undone by truth. If the fire had begun in some part of the building, perhaps there remained some physical center to the haunting, some place, some object, some source. He fled once more, this time to the library, and slammed the door behind him. The room trembled faintly. Books had fallen from the shelves. The newspapers lay scattered across the floor. The lamp on the desk burned with a long, wavering flame. Edward searched wildly through drawers, cabinets, shelves. At last, in a locked compartment already half broken, he found a ledger not of guests but of accounts and correspondence. Folded between its pages was a letter, smoke-stained and never sent. It was from Elias Whitmore, written on the evening of the fire. Edward's eyes raced over the lines. There had been debt, severe debt. Whitmore had concealed it from investors and delayed repairs to the gas pipes and wiring throughout the lower floors. He wrote of one final season, and the house surviving this winter, if fortune holds. Beneath the measured language ran desperation, shame, and a desperate love for the hotel itself, spoken of almost as if it were a living companion. "I have given it my life," the letter read, "and perhaps it will take what remains." The lamp beside Edward flared high. Midnight struck, not from any visible clock, but through the whole hotel at once. A deep, resonant toll rolled through walls, floor, and ceiling. The lamp exploded. The library plunged into darkness, lit only by a red glow seeping beneath the door. Edward threw it open. The corridor beyond was aflame. Not wholly, not naturally. Patches of old fire burned in the wallpaper, in the runner, along the ceiling beams, yet gave off little heat. Through those flames moved the pale shapes of guests and servants alike, each reliving the final horror of 1893. Some staggered, coughing through smoke. Some beat at locked doors. Some pressed themselves against walls, as if seeking escape routes that no longer existed. And all of them, again and again, turned toward Edward. He understood then. The hotel was not simply trapping souls. It was repeating its death, consuming it endlessly, and drawing in the living to complete the memory. Every new guest renewed the pattern. Another name in the book, another witness, another keeper of the rooms. He clutched Whitmore's unsent letter and forced his way back toward the lobby through heatless flame and crowds of the dead. Whitmore stood beneath the great clock as before, though now his waistcoat was blackened, his face streaked with soot, his hair singed at the temples. The polite illusion had dropped away. At last Edward saw the man not as manager, but as one more ghost among ghosts. "You knew," Edward said hoarsely. Whitmore inclined his head. "Yes. You caused it." Whitmore closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." Edward held up the letter. "Then end it." Whitmore looked at the paper in his hand with an expression so old and tired that Edward, for one brief and dreadful moment, almost pitied him. "If confession were enough," Whitmore said, "it would have ended years ago." "Then what?" Whitmore's gaze shifted to the register upon the desk. "The house must let go." "How?" Whitmore answered in a whisper. "It has never wished to." The burned guests were gathering again, filling the edges of the lobby. Mrs. Caldwell stood among them now, no longer apart. Dr. Halverson removed his spectacles with shaking fingers and put them in his pocket as though preparing for some final procedure. The dark-coated gentleman lifted his head for the first time, and Edward saw the ruin of flame across his throat. The clock's minute hand trembled past midnight. Whitmore looked at Edward with something like sorrow. "It needs a host," Edward understood too late. He lunged for the register, meaning to tear it apart, to cast it into the fire, to do anything that might break the cycle. But the instant his fingers touched the leather cover, the hotel seemed to shudder in relief. The flames died, the smoke thinned, the coughing ceased. The lobby returned to its earlier stillness, though now the silence was deeper and more absolute than before. The great clock stopped. 12 o'clock. Edward tried to pull his hand away from the register and could not. A numb cold traveled from his fingertips to his wrist, then up his arm. Names filled his vision, not only those in the book, but countless others spoken nowhere yet kept within the walls. He saw every arrival, every late knock at the door, every frightened face lifting in gratitude at the sight of the lamp outside. He saw Whitmore welcoming them all. He saw himself doing the same. "No," he whispered. Whitmore stepped forward. His features were already fading, as if light were being withdrawn from behind them. "It is done," he said. "What have you done to me?" "Only what was once done to me." One by one the other guests began to recede, not walking away, but thinning like breath on glass. Mrs. Caldwell gave Edward a final look, almost kind. Dr. Halverson bowed his head. The burned guests upon the stairs dissolved into shadow. Whitmore, too, was vanishing. Edward reached for him. "Wait." Whitmore's voice came faint and distant. "Be polite to those who arrive. They are always tired, always cold. It is the least we can do." And then he was gone. Edward stood alone in the lobby of the Ashbourne Hotel. The register lay open beneath his hand. The ink of his own signature glistened wetly upon the page, though he had signed it the previous night. Beneath it, new lines appeared in blank space, as if waiting patiently for names not yet written. He tried the front door once more. This time it opened onto a proper road, bordered by hedges silvered with moonlight. The fog had lifted just enough to show the lane stretching away into darkness. Hope struck him so violently he nearly cried aloud. He ran down the steps, and at once found himself not on the road, but standing inside the lobby again, hand upon the doorknob, the door only half open. He shut it slowly. He tried the back entrance, the cellar passage, a window in the drawing-room, a door on the third floor that opened onto a narrow iron balcony. Every exit promised freedom. Every exit returned him to the hotel. Hours passed, or perhaps moments. Time inside the Ashbourne no longer obeyed any instrument he possessed. At last he sat behind the reception desk, exhausted beyond thought, staring at the brass key to room 12 lying before him. Somewhere in the house a bell rang. Not loud, not urgent. The small bell once used to summon the manager to the desk. Edward lifted his head. From beyond the front door came the muffled sound of footsteps on wet stone. Then a knock. 3 soft raps. He knew, with the calm certainty of nightmare, that someone stood outside in the fog, tired, cold, relieved to have found shelter. His mouth went dry. He remained seated, hoping absurdly that silence might drive the traveler away. The knock came again. Then, against all his will, Edward rose. He crossed the lobby, straightened his coat, opened the door. A gentleman stood upon the step, hat wet with mist, a valise in one hand. Behind him the road lay pale and empty beneath the moon. "Good evening," the stranger said. "I beg your pardon. My carriage broke down on the road, and I fear I am quite lost. Have you a room for the night?" Edward felt words gathering in his throat like water finding a long-carved channel. He tried to resist them. He could not. "Good evening, sir," he heard himself say in a voice calm and measured, a voice that no longer sounded entirely his own. "Welcome to the Ashbourne Hotel." The stranger smiled in relief. Edward stepped aside. The man entered. And somewhere high above, behind the black windows of the upper floors, pale figures gathered soundlessly in the lamplight to watch. Still here, aren't you? Braver than most. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, feel free to like, share, and subscribe before something else does it for you. And see you around when it's time for Short Ghost Stories, Long After Midnight.